Hello there. Today's tasting is a real treat for me. The wine I have here is the 2019 vintage of Ridge Monte Bello. Now, Montebello is often referred to as a Cabernet. This is predominantly Cabernet, but in this vintage it's 82% Cabernet Sauvignon. So this is a Bordeaux blend. Evidently there's 9% of Merlot, 8% of Petit Verdot, and a single percentage of Cabernet Franc went into this particular blend. Montebello is a historic vineyard. It was first planted in 1886 and it lies in the Santa Cruz Mountains just south of San Jose at an altitude of about 2,700 feet above sea level. That's about 800 meters. Dual cooling influences of the altitude and of the fact that the mountains are close to the deep Pacific Ocean and the cooling Humboldt current that comes close inshore. So it's in quite a contrast to the sort of the richer, riper styles of the warmer climate Cabernets that come from, say, the valley floor in Napa. And this cool growing season enables the Cabernet to produce perhaps a little bit more acidity, a bit more elegance. As I say, the vineyards here were first planted in 1886. However, of course, during Prohibition in the 30s, they fell into disuse. And by the 1940s, they'd been practically abandoned. In 1949, about 8 acres were replanted with Cabernet Sauvignon. And then in the 1960s, the estate was bought by a group of Stanford graduates, and I think their idea was that this was going to be a holiday home in the hills. But actually they got quite seriously into the winemaking side of things and started replanting the vineyards. And then in 1969 they employed Paul Draper, these days an absolutely legendary winemaker. And the rest, as they say, is history, quite literally. The 1971 vintage of Montebello was included in Stephen Spurrier's Judgment of Paris tasting, coming 5th amongst the red wines. And in fact, in the 40 Years On tastings that were done in 2016, the wine came first, both in the tasting in California and that in London. So clearly a wine that had the ability to age. 2019 as a vintage started with abundant rainfall through the winter months. In fact, there was quite a fair amount of precipitation right into mid-May. However, this was followed by a really warm, dry summer. So a large crop was set and the conditions enabled it to ripen both evenly and completely. In fact, when it came to the blending process, an unparalleled number of lots were included in the final blend. Something like 41 different lots of wines went into this wine. So how's the wine made? The fruit was entirely hand-picked. The vineyards are farmed organically, and on arrival at the winery, a proportion of the fruit, about 15%, went through an optical sorter to reject any substandard, small or damaged fruit. All the fruit went into the fermenting vats as whole berries, so allowing quite sort of soft maceration rather than mashing everything up by putting it through a crusher first. And that also, because the berries have to split to reveal the juice and to expose the pips, it means you get a sort of a softer extraction and a longer ferment. Fermentation took place with the indigenous yeasts that had found their way into the winery on the fruit. And a post-fermentation maceration lasted 8 days before pressing took place. Malolactic conversion again took place with the naturally occurring bacteria that had come into the vats on the fruit. The wine was then aged in 225-litre oak barrels. Now, these were predominantly made from American oak. This is a feature of Ridge in their winemaking, the use of American oak, but there's air-dried rather than kiln-dried American oak, so that tones down the vanilla nature of the oak quite substantially. So 95% of the oak used was American and 5% was French, but both of them high-quality air-dried oak. The wine aged in barrel for 17 months and was then lightly filtered into bottle. So let's look at it, shall we? As a first impression, that is deep, dark and distinctly opaque. There's a purple ruby colour there. As I swirl the wine, it clings to the glass and it is slightly staining the glass actually. There's starting to be some quite obvious tears there. The label tells me the alcohol is 13.7%. and I'm expecting this is a fairly tannic wine, so there should be a certain amount of viscosity here. Let's see what we'll make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are intense and they're very pure. There's a black curranty note, there's a juicy, rich boysenberry note, and there are touches of black cherry in there. behind that, there's some really quite exciting sweet spice. Cinnamon running to cedar. There are touches of vanilla as well. I'm talking about these things as if they were distinct from each other, but actually they run into each other. They're very harmoniously together. There's the powerful, juicy, dark fruit is beautifully blended with the sweet spice notes from the oak. So let's taste. The palate is dry, and it shows two things to begin with. Firstly, the lovely fresh acidity, and that really does reflect where the fruit has been grown at a high altitude near the cool ocean. And yet there's beautiful ripeness as well. There's good sunshine in the Santa Cruz Mountains. There's ripeness and richness, but then that is really kept in check by a lovely, beautiful, fine vanilla and cedar oak. It's got such a fine texture, and it's very present. It's running right the way through there, but the fruit is so powerful that the two are beautifully integrated. And there's a vanilla-y sort of cocoa butter note, maybe the slightest hint of coffee, sort of suggesting a little bitterness in there, but again, just as it starts to seem bitter, the juiciness of the sort of almost black cherry-like fruit on the mid-palate comes to round it out. And there's such lovely freshness. The finish is coming out with sort of black curranty notes, and that sort of almost a hint of leafiness. It's got that sort of cut to it that's so beautifully fresh. As I say, the oak, as with the nose, so finely intertwined with the fairly rich, juicy black fruit. The two, you can't see where one begins and the other ends. There's a wonderful smooth texture. I mean, I was talking about the tannins being grainy. They are grainy, but there's a suppleness to the back palate. You know, there was maybe a slightly drying touch at the beginning. I mean, this is a very young wine. If you reckon that it's probably a wine that you could age for at least 20 years and probably longer. This is in its very first flushes of youth. And as I say, you can still see it there, staining the glass. This is, for a young wine, it's impressively approachable, and yet clearly shows with its concentration, its precision in terms of its acidity, that this is a wine that has a long future ahead of it. I mean, the structure is just absolutely beautiful. So yes, thank you very much for watching. It's a real pleasure to try this wine. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the tasting. If you ever get the chance to try Ridge wines, I highly recommend them. The quality of all the wines in their range really shows through, and you can see why they're so popular. If you've enjoyed the tasting, do please press the like button below. Do please consider sharing it with your friends if you think they would be interested in watching as well. Please leave any comments you have. It'd be fantastic to hear what you think about these wines or other wines that you've tried. And if you'd like, it would be great if you'd sign up and follow us on YouTube. We'd love to have your support. And then that way, hopefully we'll see you again for another tasting in the near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.